Hi, and thank you for being here today. My name is Amy Bryant of Wild Child Counseling here in Atlanta, Georgia, and Parenting Beyond Punishment, which is an online educational and support community. And I am really excited to be here today with my friend and colleague, Robbyn Bennett of StopSpanking.org. She's a psychotherapist in Portland, Oregon, and we are welcoming a special guest today, Tracie Afifi. And Robbyn, I'd love for you to introduce her.
Well, wonderful. It's great to be here today. Today we're going to be talking about the research on spanking, and we've invited a wonderful special guest, Dr. Tracie Afifi. She is an amazing researcher. She is the Associate Professor of the Department of Community of Health and Sciences and the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Manitoba. She has received many awards, including the Canadian Coalition for the Rights of the Children, the Children's Rights Support Award, the CIHR New Investigator Award. I think she's so prolific, really, as a researcher in the field of child abuse and neglect, and she's made this marvelous connection to help us understand how that relates to spanking. She's also done quite a lot of research on spanking and how that connects to adverse childhood experiences. She just co-edited a special edition with Child Abuse and Neglect on the harm of spanking and how it in and of itself is also considered an adverse childhood experience. And I think you have 100 research articles that you've done to date, which is, if you're in the field of research, mind-boggling. So welcome. It's so nice to have you here today.
Thanks for having me.
So I thought what we could do is we could just start out with talking about if you could just give us a little summary of what the research tells us so far. Just give us a summary.
Sure.
Start with that.
So there's actually been quite a few studies that have looked at spanking and the harmful consequences related to spanking. So they can be related to poor outcomes with regard to mental health, with physical health, with developmental milestones. They can have an impact on your relationships. And at first we kind of thought that we could see, children who are spanked would have more aggression in childhood, and we'd sort of think of spanking literature within childhood. But the literature also has gone beyond that, and we can see that spanking in childhood can have an impact for some individuals into adolescence and right across the lifespan. So you can see in a lot of these research studies that if you were spanked in childhood, sometimes there's negative consequences that those individuals will carry with them across the lifespan. So what's really important is understanding that there is this relationship, because we didn't always know that. We used to think spanking was a normal part of parenting and it's what we should do. And if we want to be good parents, this is what we do. So people were encouraged to do that in the past. And now all of a sudden we have this mountain of research that sort of shows us that it might not be safe and it could lead to harmful consequences. So we're at the point now where we need to think about that and help parents replace the tool of spanking with something that's non-physical, that's not related to the harmful consequences, that's effective in guiding the child or stopping the unwanted behavior, and that doesn't put them at risk. So really understanding how we do that and to prevent the spanking from happening in the first place.
I really love the way you put it, because, I'm in a lot of conversations with people about spanking, and it's pretty remarkable how upsetting this topic is. And so just the fact that you're helping us remember that this, first of all, is a parenting practice that's been around for a very long time. And also it's been promoted by the professional community earlier and so that there was a wide acceptance, and that because I think a lot of parents, all of us, are very sensitive to being shamed around parenting because it's already so hard. And to have someone challenge us around spanking and to make us wrong, it's a, it's not an easy topic to discuss, for
Yeah,
sure.
absolutely. It's not. And, it's one of those things that um, everyone seems to have an opinion on, whether they have children or not. Because, if you're an adult and you don't have children, you've had a childhood, and so you've formed opinions based on your own experiences. And yeah, it was one of those things that we didn't really know it was harmful. We thought it was a good thing to do. So parents were encouraged to do that. So we have a lot of things happening. You have, society and culture and knowledge and parenting behavior, and all of that's coming together. So you still have people that support spanking from, a almost because of it's part of their culture or their history. But really, what we need to do is understand that the parents that spanked in the past were not bad parents. They probably were great parents, and they were doing it because they thought that was what the right thing was to do. And now we have all this information that it isn't safe, and it's related to harmful outcomes. So it doesn't make those parents bad parents, but what it does is now we need to use this data to help parents change their behavior and move forward in a new direction.
Yeah, that's lovely. Well, so um, do we know anything about the outcomes if you don't spank? Because I want to kind of get into the negative outcomes, but my initial sort of feeling about it is this is going to be depressing. And so I'm wondering if we can maybe start by offering parents, what do we know about the outcomes when you actually are able to abstain from using spanking as discipline?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of information on attachment and parent-child relationship, and I think that's really, really key. Because what we're doing is, if we are spanking, we're jeopardizing that relationship, and I think that's one of the, I feel like, the strongest positive sides of it is that if you have and can create an environment where there's love and there's trust and there's communication. That doesn't mean, I think often people also think spanking equals discipline, however we want to refer to as discipline. So it doesn't mean that households who don't spank don't have rules or boundaries. But I think what we know from the literature is that those who do not spank actually will nurture this really wonderful relationship with their child, and it's rooted in love and attachment, and I think that's a really important thing.
Yeah, and I would think too that that means there's greater joy and pleasure for the parents, less worry, more connection. Um, I I wonder if you could maybe just start with telling us one of the things that I'm interested in is our concern over domestic violence. And of course, we know that's a huge problem for sure in the United States. And I'm wondering, what does the research say about spanking and domestic violence? And can you help us sort of understand why there would be a link, or what
Right.
the research might be able to help us understand? Because a lot of the reactivity around the research is the old saying, um, correlation is not causation.
Right.
So just because they're correlated doesn't mean one is causing the other.
Yeah.
So maybe you could speak to that.
Yeah, so there are thousands and thousands of studies in the area of spanking and child abuse and child maltreatment and intimate partner violence. But what was really surprising to me a few years ago, when I started to dig deeper in the relationship between physical punishment and intimate relationships in adulthood. So the physical punishments happening when they're children, but what do their intimate relationships look like in adulthood? And what I was actually surprised is I had a really hard time finding very many studies in that area. So even though there's lots of studies on those things individually, there's less information on both of those things together.
Mm.
So there's really just a small number of those studies. So there's some theories if we want to think about like why in theory why could be there be a relationship between experiencing spanking or harsh physical punishment in childhood to how your relationships will be like in adulthood. So from a theoretical perspective, there's lots of reasons why we can think about it. So we could think about it as if you grow up in an environment where there's violence or there's harsh treatment of others, where we respond with communicating almost more physically than verbally. So we're teaching people not to do things, the kids not to do things by hitting them. Then the children are growing up in an environment where that sort of becomes the norm. So that's almost acceptable way to communicate and interact with people. So there's that. There could be modeling behavior, so where they see their parents acting in that way, whether it's their own violence towards between the parents and also from the parent to the child, so they can see that that's happening again. That a child who grows up in that environment, that becomes normal. So they don't look at it and think of it as, oh, my family's different. A child will think that that's what families are like, and that's how you communicate and interact with people. So it kind of sets people up for almost a tolerance or an acceptance, or it doesn't even raise red flags for people if later they're in adolescence, they start dating, or in adulthood, and people are sort of acting more aggressively to them, whether it's verbally or physically or sexually in relationships. They might not even feel that that's abnormal. So that's one theory of how it can sort of be passed from childhood into your adolescent and adult.
So it's kind of a sensitization, really. And so, and you mentioned sexual abuse. Is there a correlation between spanking and being I guess I'm trying to find the link there. Is there a link?
So yeah, so looking for there's a link between spanking and being having experiences of even more harsh physical punishment. So what some people may not even consider abuse for some, so pushing, grabbing, shoving, which might be a little bit different than simply how we would define spanking, but still in that spectrum. And looking at sexual, there's definitely a link between that and experiencing sexual abuse as in childhood. So we've looked at that in our studies. So harsh physical punishment, pushing, grabbing, shoving, those kids who experience that are more likely to experience sexual abuse within childhood, but they're also more likely to experience violence within adult relationships, which could be verbal violence, it could be sexual violence, and it could be physical violence, or a combination of all those things, because sometimes those things don't happen in isolation. They kind of can happen together.
Yeah, and there's lots of ways to think about that. I think what's really stunning is that spanking is actually linked to negative outcomes in adulthood, domestic violence, of course, drug and alcohol abuse, all of those sorts of things, but we can link those to behaviors and modeling. But also that, I was struck by a study, not just the ACEs study that you did, but there was one you did earlier that linked corporal punishment to physical health problems. So it seems then that spanking in my conversations with Dr. Stephen Porges the other day, we were talking about putting the system when the nervous system is in a state for defense rather than restoration, the body functions very differently. And it's my understanding that spanking and kinds of harsh discipline can put a child's system, their nervous system, into recruiting it for defense, which then causes the system to be taxed in certain ways that over time, as you become an adult, you can actually be compromised in terms of your overall physical health and well-being.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we've actually done 2 papers now that look at physical health outcomes. And so one looking at child abuse outcomes and physical health, and that was using Canadian data. and one looking at harsh physical punishment and other types of child maltreatment, and looking at physical health outcomes using American data. And so the studies aren't directly comparable because the types of parenting techniques that we looked at were different, and the physical health outcomes were different, but the trends and the overall conclusions from two different data sets from two different countries were the same. And that was harsh treatment in childhood, whether it's pushing, grabbing, shoving, or more physical abuse, was associated with increased likelihood of some poor physical health outcomes. So in those papers, we do talk about why that might be the case, because some people might be able to accept the link between spanking and mental health, and less likely to accept the link, well, how could spanking have an impact on your physical health? And so what you described is one pathway. And we've, there's lots of people that do research out there that look at those mechanisms and those pathways. So it could be through a lot of pathways. The one that you've mentioned, it could be as simple as also having sleep deprivation. So kids who are experiencing harsh treatment during childhood actually have harder time sleeping, and we're looking at that right now. We have a study that's looking at sleep right now, and they don't sleep as well. They sleep for a while.
They have trouble with arousal. They don't fall into deep sleep. And when you say harsh parenting, is spanking considered harsh parenting?
Yeah. So in our study, we do look at spanking in our study that we're still working on, that's yet to be published. But sometimes I'll say the word harsh parenting instead of just spanking, because a lot of our studies we look at, and it's pushing, grabbing, shoving, hitting, and slapping. And so I don't want to use, so that's what's in our data. And that might be different. That's in some of our data. Some studies we look at is defined more clearly as a spank with an open hand on a bum, which is what people are, which is a more typical definition of spanking. So I just always want to be clear that I don't want to call things like pushing, grabbing, and slapping spanking, and then
So when you're talking about the long-term physical outcome problems, you're talking more that more inclusive definition, that it would be more like some of the things we see where people use implements to hit children, that kind of thing.
Yeah, what we're very careful to do in our studies when we look at whether it's spanking or pushing, grabbing, shoving, hitting, what we're very careful to do, and I think this is, sort of an important thing to do in research now and moving forward, is we want to know, so for some people who experience those things, they're more likely to also experience harsher physical abuse and sexual abuse and neglect and emotional maltreatment. But there are some people, and so what people will, people who are critics of the research will say, well, it's actually not the spanking, because those kids were also physically abused. So it's actually abuse. So what we're very careful to do is we also assess the individual's abuse history. So we want to make sure that we're either adjusting for that or taking that out. So what we'll do is we'll look at the people that have experienced no spanking, no harsh physical punishment, no abuse, and that's one category. Then we compare it to people who have only experienced the spanking or the harsh physical punishment. And then we have another group that experience child abuse. And what we'll see, no matter what our outcome is, we could have it as a mental health outcome, we could have it as physical health outcome, we could choose our outcome, even sleep. And what you see is that it's the more violence a person experiences, the worse their outcome is. So spanking may not show as strong statistics as someone who is severely physically abused, but it's much worse than someone who hasn't experienced any of those things. So it's almost like you see a stepwise increase.
Okay. So like
the dose response relationship.
Okay. So it's sort of like on a continuum, and abuse is really high and spanking's quite a bit. It is lower than abuse, but much lower than that is not spanking. So spanking it's kind of telling us, the data is telling us that spanking is it's a low dose violence.
It functions exactly the same as child abuse. We test it empirically and use
Wow.
fancy statistical models where we don't have to get into the details there, but basically what we've done, and that's what we did with the ACEs paper in child abuse neglect that came out in 2017, which is a freely available paper. So you can just download it from Child Abuse Neglect website for free. You don't need any
We'll we'll
plugins.
be sure to put that link in the
Yeah.
YouTube at the end of this so people can
Yes.
get hold of it.
Yeah. So that's where all the technical details are in that paper. But what basically the simple version of that is we we wanted to know if spanking from a statistical perspective looks the same in data as other child abuse and types of child abuse neglect. And what we found was empirically, so within the data, it loaded with or was similar to physical abuse and emotional abuse. So those three things went together.
Oh,
They
oh, yes.
in terms of data. So
Yeah,
not in terms of theory, although that's we can theorize why that would be the case.
yeah.
But when we just look at the actual data,
Mm.
statistically those grouped together, which means they're empirically there's a similarity between those things. So spanking empirically with data looks the same as other types of abuse, even though
It's interesting too because I'm sorry to interrupt you. Um, it's interesting because the way emotional abuse is described in the ACE study, or emotional neglect, is the sense that either no one cared for me or I didn't have anyone that I could go to feel supported. So the emotional piece of it is sort of the internal state of feeling disconnected and not held and not loved,
yeah,
and that spanking would be maybe generating these
yeah.
kinds of dynamics.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So we were able to show that, and for that reason, as well as spanking is related to the same outcomes as child abuse, so more severe physical abuse, sexual abuse, etc. Um, because the relationships are the same, empirically it looks the same. We were able to conclude that spanking is an adverse childhood experience. It functions the same way in data as these
E-
other types of maltreatment.
Even if there's not any other problems in the family, no other domestic distress or,
Yes. Yeah. So
okay.
all of our studies try to control for a lot of things. So they will try to narrow in on only that act of spanking or harsh physical punishment, depending on which study we're looking at. And those people, so separate from any experiences of abuse, because we try to look at it just those people that experience that only without being otherwise abused.
Yes.
But we also, in a lot of our studies, we look at what we call household dysfunction, or sometimes we call it household challenges.
Yeah.
So we try to, in our statistical models, account for that. So if the person has parents who had a bad divorce, or parents who suffer from substance abuse, parents who've been incarcerated, other challenges that might also impact these outcomes, we put those into our statistical models so that whatever problems would be related to those things would be controlled for in the model, so that we
Yeah.
can just find out, even when we're putting all that into our statistical models, does spanking or does harsh physical punishment still have a significant relationship? And it almost always does in everything that we look at.
Yeah, that's really compelling. It makes sense then why, particularly the fact that you published this ACEs and spanking research with the Centers for Disease Control here in the United States. And they came out formally with a recommendation to, well, one is they consider spanking a public health concern, and that it should be ended. People should not be spanking. And they also indicated that there should be legislative effort made to prohibit spanking, which is a fairly remarkable statement coming from the Centers for Disease Control in the United States, when somewhere around 75% or more of parents spank their children. So it tells you, for them to take that kind of risk and that kind of position, how concerning this is in terms of going more upstream and trying to prevent adverse childhood experiences.
Yeah, and absolutely. And now we have all this data that show how that experience of being spanked is related to so many physical and mental health outcomes. And, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention wants to prevent many things from occurring. So it's really, if we can prevent the spanking, then we will prevent many poor outcomes for those individuals. So
Yeah.
they'll increase their likelihood of not having mental disorders or not having physical health conditions later on in life. And so the thinking is, if we can prevent the spanking from happening, you're actually improving their health across the lifespan.
Yeah, physical health, not just emotional health, right?
Emotional health, physical health, and then bringing it back to these relationships, intimate partner violence, you're also improving relationships with people. So when you think about it, if you can improve relationships and decrease the likelihood of having violence within the home and violence between your dating and your intimate partners, you're creating environments within your home that are just better equipped to have positive interactions with your family. You're going to be able to function in the world in a better way.
You're going to feel better. And
Yeah.
it's really interesting too, because it really comes down to, at a deep level, feeling connected. We're such relational creatures. We have to, I read something the other day, a saying that said, I cannot know myself until you see me. We are that dependent on each other for our identity, for our sense of well-being, for all of that. And, the thing that really struck me that made me so sad, because it is so preventable, is that when you look at the adverse childhood experiences study, for example, we know that, of course, a lot of the negative outcomes are behaviors that are response to the need to self-soothe,
Yeah.
because relationships are harder to navigate, because that person doesn't have the same kind of ability to feel safe with other people. So a lot of the conclusions have been, well, then you develop these, poor coping mechanisms that are health hazards, like smoking and drug abuse and things like that. But the interesting thing about the data that's been looked at recently is that even if you don't adopt negative behaviors, people with high ACE scores still have a higher rate of health problems. So we know that it's not just a psychological thing, that it's an embodiment of how relationships drive our physiology in such a huge way. But I wanted to I'm sort of trying to hear what some people that reject the research as being driven by a liberal agenda, by being driven, there's lots of reactivity there. But I think one of the questions would be, isn't there a fine line, if I only spank my child every once in a while and then I just give them the look and they know I mean business? I mean, isn't that different? I don't push, grab, shove. I'm not a harsh parent, that sort of thing. What would
Yeah.
the research say?
Well, so the thing is, I actually, there's two things I want to say to that. The first thing is, if you look at all the research, and now there's hundreds and thousands of studies that are very well crafted, good quality studies that show that spanking is related to a mountain of negative outcomes.
Yeah.
There isn't one study that exists that says that spanking is associated with a positive outcome for a child. So I think that's really powerful. So it's almost, and so that's sort of where that special issue in child abuse and neglect came from. Was I decided I'm tired of having the debate of whether or not we should or should spank our children, because when we debate something, there's information on both sides, but there's no information on the other side of this one. It's all of it says it has a negative outcome for the child. There isn't one study that shows a positive outcome for the child if they're hit. So to me, I felt like, okay, we need to draw the line in the sand now. Stop having this argument and instead invest our energy in how do we help parents understand and change behaviors. So change their own parenting behavior. So give them tools that are safe. And to the other side of that, for people that say things like, well, I don't hit my kid very often, or I'm not abusing them. And also people, will, even though spanking a child is striking them with an open hand, they might not define it as hitting, but really you are hitting a child when you're spanking. So there's language, terminology that's difficult. But what I think is really important to understand is that we could never know if there's a threshold that's safe. We could never know that because we would have to do randomized controlled trials, which are completely unethical, to
Right.
try to determine if there's a way that we can, spank and whatever. That doesn't exist. So when people say spanking is safe if you do it, and then they give you guidelines,
Yeah.
that's just an opinion. There's no evidence behind that. So that is
Right.
not something that's been shown to be proven in any way. So that we shouldn't listen to that because, that maybe if you hit a child once or twice a week and that child is okay, and doesn't have any negative outcomes, that doesn't mean the next child is going to have the same outcomes. So for
Right.
some children, the threshold may be very low. For some kids, it might be very high. And when we say that it's associated with the increased likelihood of outcomes, not everyone who's spanked will experience those negative outcomes,
Right.
but it increases the chances that you will.
Yeah.
So we're taking a risk. We're taking a chance
Right.
doing that.
And too great of a risk in a way. Too great of a risk is the problem.
Yeah, and I like to bring it to the policies and the thinking on drinking alcohol while you're pregnant. So we don't do studies to see is there a threshold of some amount of alcohol, is that okay?
Right.
What we do is we don't know. We know that it's harmful and that it can have detrimental outcomes. And so we are the proper thing to do and the right thing to do is to recommend to mothers who are pregnant, don't drink alcohol when you're pregnant. And
Yeah.
there's policies and there's social or public messaging of that all over when in communities. And I think that's the same thing for hitting.
That's so interesting. I've not heard someone use that analogy before, and I'm really struck by it. Amy, have you heard that before? It's really interesting to me. Why are we more careful? Well, of course, I want to be very careful with the fetus. We know from brain science that's hugely important.
Yeah.
But it's so interesting that we're more accepting of not drinking alcohol, but the spanking we're having a harder time with.
Yeah. And so I think it's really sorry, go ahead, Amy.
Oh no, I was just thinking what a lovely thing it would be if when the mother is pregnant, we say it's best not to drink, and when the baby is born, we say it's best not to spank.
Yeah,
It could
absolutely.
just be a part of that continuum. Welcome
Yes.
to motherhood.
Yeah.
Spanking is detrimental,
And
Yes.
right?
it's the same thinking. It's the same. I mean, we're replacing the variables in the model, but it's the same thinking between both of them. It's a very comparison. So, but from a public health perspective, this is the stance we take as a society.
Right.
We strongly encourage pregnant women not to drink alcohol. Because you know what? If you drank one glass of wine, would it be okay? Maybe. We don't know. So let's not take the risk. And
Yes.
so that should be the same public health and same policy and same messaging that is connected for spanking. And
Yeah, because the outcomes are so severe and they're so enduring. That's the thing that was so striking to me is that, and when you study early trauma in general, just understanding that the first 4 years of life are so vulnerable anyway, but they have this cascading effect over time. And, what we do early on has such implications for the child feeling well in their life in general.
and and that's when you're building that relationship. That's the building blocks of those early years, and you want to have this strong attachment. And if you can have strong attachment, but then if you're also using spanking with your attachment parenting, if that's happening, then you're jeopardizing those relationships.
Yes. Amy, is there anything that you're holding that you want to say before I jump into another topic?
I just love this. I will just bring the time to y'all's attention. We're about 40 minutes in. But I think that this conversation is invaluable for what we know about children, and then bring in that piece that parents really need support. And that's why we have this event every year.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Because when you think about it, a woman may be drinking alcohol for reasons to cope. We may be spanking because we can't find any other coping mechanisms. So really all of our behaviors are based on adapting and coping. And so what we're trying to do here is just help mothers and fathers feel more supported, more liberated, and to have a way to learn other things, and and not to carry shame around this either, because this is our inheritance. We have all inherited this through our own personal trauma of being hit ourselves, and on back through the generations. So one of the things I'm really interested in is in the States, what we're really worried about and we're really starting to understand is the impact of bullying. And we focus a lot on bullying in schools and how children bully each other. And of course, we know that particularly as children hit latency age and then go into adolescence, this is just can be devastating. But I'm wondering, I always think in my head, gee, where did these children learn to push around when they're angry? And how did they learn to pick on someone else? And is there any correlation to spanking and behaviors of bullying? Because, of course, I have lots of anecdotal experience as a clinician seeing this, but I'm wondering from a research perspective.
Yeah, so again, there's a mountain of research on child abuse, and and spanking and harsh parenting, and there's a mountain of research on bullying now. That's a very big area. And just recently, are we seeing sort of these literatures coming together? So we're just starting to see some papers being published on that relationship between and even it's not even, actually don't even know, it's more right now in the more child abuse, so the more severe than spanking, and looking at the relationships. So what and we're also, that's we have many studies going on our research team right now that's looking at that, and we will be looking at just spanking alone and how that has an impact on their relationships with their peers at school and their experiences of bullying. And we're looking at about I think it's 9 different types of bullying, so we're a lot of detail on that bullying part.
Wow.
So
and one piece about that too is just not the bullying, not just that my child would be a bully, but I also see that some children that are spanked and they're quite submissive are targeted.
that's great.
I wonder about that side too.
So we're looking at, we're currently working on studies that look at both being a perpetrator of bullying and being a victim of bullying.
Wow.
Some people are both, right? That's
right.
Or a victim and a perpetrator of bullying, for lack of better terms. But so we're just starting to get into that literature. I'm an associate editor of Child Abuse and Neglect, and so it's interesting because you can kind of see the trends where the literature is going by being an editor at a journal, because all these papers get submitted, and I'm just starting to see those papers get submitted for publication. So there are definitely lots of people out there, I think, that are interested in those exact questions, and we're sort of, I think, I mean, there are studies out there, but there's not a lot. And I think we're just starting, over the next couple of years, I think we're going to learn a lot on that area. But I think people are starting to think about that. What's the relationship between the home environment and the school environment? It can be, we also have to think about it, the school environment as potentially being a supportive place and a place to learn and grow, and figuring out how we can develop that for some kids, because for some kids who are experiencing have a harsh home environment, it's actually the school. Hopefully, they can find some safety and comfort in the school.
Yes, many children do.
Yeah, and
it's often their lifeline,
That's right. So we need to learn more about that. But then imagine that child who feels unsafe or experiences spanking or harsh treatment at home, and then goes to school and is experiencing the same thing. Like there's no lifeline for that child.
Yeah, it's just doubled up on them, really.
I wasn't also experiencing spanking at school.
Yeah.
Which is legal here in the United States. And
yeah, absolutely. So in Canada, we don't do that, but I know that isn't the case for all areas of the United States, and that's a big one. That's a big one that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, in 19 states in the U.S., paddling is still occurring, and there's around 200,000 children, somewhere, although I think the number is dropping some. Tennessee just banned corporal punishment in schools. So that's really excellent
But
news.
only for children with disabilities.
Yes, yes. So it's a incremental, it's slow. People in these schools don't really know alternatives, so it's really hard for them to let go of it in lieu of something else. I did want to get some clarification because I wasn't quite sure. With the literature, do we know anything about bullying and overt child abuse yet, or is that also still just sort of coming
Yeah,
out?
yeah. So being so looking at bullying of the parent, like, are you talking about parents' experience of when they were being bullied?
No, I'm just wondering if if the research shows anything between if the child is being overtly abused in the home,
Yeah.
is there an increased chance of school bullying or
Yeah, so
being a
that's
victim?
that's what we're looking at right now.
Okay.
In our that's mainly what we're looking at, but we also have spanking at home, not just child abuse as well. So we're looking at those relationships now.
Okay.
We're actually also looking at, we're doing a study right now that we're just into the data, so I don't have any indication of what's going to happen, but we are actually looking at the parents' experiences of when they were kids, if they experienced verbal and physical bullying as kids, are they more likely to spank their own children? So,
Oh, that's
so
interesting.
we're actually going in both directions because
Oh, wow.
parent becomes a parent with their own history and their own experiences, and
Mhm.
that history and experiences really influence how you approach parenting. And so we're looking at the parents' experiences as a child, so both verbal and physical bullying from their peers, whether they were spanked, whether they experienced all 5 different types of child maltreatment, and then currently their current challenges. So current challenges with their in their relationships. So we have sort of their history and also challenges that might be happening in the household right now, and looking at trying to see the picture of how does this all come together to understand who's more likely to use spanking on their children. And our hope is that we can figure some of these things out and then use it for prevention efforts.
Yeah, like help parents who have been bullied digest what happened to them, right? Because that bullying is amazing how it just generates a sense of shame and reactivity in the body, not just emotionally, but the body can be reactive. I've known people that have experienced harsh punishment or have been bullied early on, and it gets activated as an adult, and they don't even know where it's coming from.
Yeah, and often, it's nowhere. They, like you say, they can't process it because they're not aware that there's something there to process. But that's what's so great about doing research at a population level like this. We can find these relationships in data, and then we can use that to educate and then help people to intervene and then hopefully prevent other occurrences moving forward.
What strikes me too about it is that we can actually start caring about parents that were bullied as children or were experiencing spanking or had horrible school experiences, because one of the things that has been so moving to me in looking at the adverse childhood experiences study and some interventions they've done is just asking people, just asking a mother what happened to you when you were a child
Yeah.
changes outcomes, because now she feels heard, she feels that you're connecting and listening. And that huge shift too between, what's wrong with you as a parent, why are you doing this, to what happened to you, what happened to you. It
Yeah.
helps us make sense of why we lose control with our children so easily, or why do we feel so anxious, or that it's not about I'm damaged and I'm wrong and I'm bad, but rather things have happened to me that I'm highly adapted
Mhm.
to stress. And
Mhm.
then how do I begin to come to a place where I feel safer in my own body? And
Yeah.
so that whole sort of, it's a pretty big shift.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not about, blaming parents or judging parents. It's about understanding that parenting is hard. It's a
Oh,
hard
really hard.
marathon. It's not a quick sprint. It's a marathon, and it's hard, and there's a lot of moving parts. What your needs of, within a family, one day it can be different the next day and down the road. So
Yes.
it's very challenging, and I think it's really important that we, if we're saying things like spanking, for example, can have harmful consequences, we're taking that away from parents, right? We're saying, okay, this is the tool you use. We're going to take it away from you now. So we need to be there to support and guide and help them replace that with a
Yes.
new tool. And so that's a process, and
Hmm.
that we need to take. Mhm.
Yes. So, is there anything you're thinking about, Amy, as you're sort of taking all this information? And I get a little bit flooded by all the data. There's so much.
I've been grounding myself with some sensory experiences
Have
lately.
you? I
Yeah.
have coffee, but I'm afraid that's not going to ground me.
Yeah,
It might get me more wound up.
right.
Um, Can you say anything? I don't know if you were aware that Oprah was talking to Dr. Bruce Perry on 60
ACEs.
Minutes. It was at 60 Minutes
Mhm.
about adverse childhood experiences. And she had this beautiful kind of awakening around this question of what happened to you, not what's wrong with you.
Mhm.
And I'm really hoping that now that adverse childhood experiences are really hitting the public media channels and Oprah's picking it up, that we can start to have a way to talk about spanking, because I think it's a topic that most child uh, focused organizations that are trying to support families tiptoe around and aren't really quite sure how to speak to without alienating parents and making them feel worse, which is kind of what talking about ACEs can do if you don't talk about resiliency and how do we build in resiliency. And
Yeah.
do you have any thoughts about all of that?
Yeah, I feel like we feel there's a shift happening right now, where we're hopefully moving in the direction where we can have those conversations and do it in a way that isn't alienating. It's not making people feel upset or defensive, because to be honest, it's not about that. It's not about calling parents who spank bad parents, because often I think they're doing it because they think they're doing the right thing, and they love their kids, and they're not trying to hurt them, and
No.
just, this is what they think is what they're supposed to do. And I think having place that people who work with, whether it's a healthcare professional, or health or professional associations or agencies, having them tiptoe around the issue doesn't help. And because it's so controversial, I think sometimes the case is that people don't want to, like you say, alienate those parents who do it. So they, instead of coming out with a statement, they might avoid it completely,
Yes.
or they might come up with something that's sort of soft, like where it's, we advise against it, but almost that there's room for, well, other things are better, but, or use it as a last resort, something like that.
Or
And I
try
actually,
not to use it. It's
yeah,
probably
try
better
not
not
to.
to.
But so in our messaging, in our research, we, because of that, we are very clear, and our messaging is physical punishment should not be used on children of any age. So, and we try to just make it very clear, because I think that in order to really move forward and to make efforts with prevention, a lot of things need to come together, and a lot of those things might be changing of legislation and changing policies. It might be, there's changing culture as well.
Yes.
Whether it's an individual's culture, whether it's within someone's religion, or a broader society culture within a broader society.
Yeah.
Um, it's so in Canada we also are allowed by law to hit children. There's rules around it. They have to be between ages of 2 and 12, and you can't hit them in the head. You can't hit them if they have disabilities. So they put all these rules around it. But there's also a lot of gray zone, and it still leads to a culture that tolerates violence against children. So until that changes, and in over I think it's 35 countries worldwide completely banned spanking. So it's not a new concept. It started in 1979, and there's I think it's 35 countries now. The total is
50, it's 53.
oh, sorry, 53. Oh, there you go.
Yeah,
Yeah. So that
it's
was
a lot.
yeah, yeah. I think actually when I first started doing research in the area, it was in the 30s. That's why that number came up to me. But so
Yeah, it's amazing how
yeah,
fast it's
yeah,
Mhm.
changed.
yeah. So it's
Ireland just recently,
yeah,
even, you know,
yeah. So it's not a new concept, it's not
no,
a new concept. And I feel like unless you really want to see real shifts and real changes, it has to sort of happen from a big perspective.
yes.
And not softly, not where there's try not to do it kind of messages.
Right. Well, and we are in a culture that's extremely punitive. So
Mhm.
a part of this is shifting our institutions to not relate to and respond to parents in punitive ways. And
Mhm.
so I think some of the pushback is that there's been a lot of harm done
Mm-hmm.
by our, particularly the legal, uh, you know, part of our culture is that people are afraid of getting in trouble and being hurt rather than feeling that they can approach institutions that would help them do better and feel better.
Yeah,
So it's a huge ship that we're trying to turn here,
Yeah.
because parents have good reason for feeling unsupported and afraid of being judged
yeah.
and that kind of thing.
But having people like Oprah come forward and really put it in the spotlight, that is just unreal, and that
Yeah.
was
It's beautiful. I had chills because it's really opening, it's bringing compassion towards parents, and we try
yeah,
to help each other
that's right.
rather than pressuring, putting
Yeah.
more on parents
Yeah,
And shaming.
and
that's
I
right.
think
shaming.
it's worth saying that, even creating laws around this, it's not about us wanting to punish parents for
Absolutely.
hitting their children. It's about change, like y'all have said, changing the cultural views around this
Hmm.
and
Yes.
helping people learn there are so many alternatives, an
Yeah.
infinite number of alternatives.
And that's not the purpose of the laws too. Like the purpose of the law isn't to put parents in jail. Obviously, the parents
Right.
are going to be not their life is not going to be improved if all of a sudden their parent is in.
No.
And in countries like Sweden who have changed laws, the idea was to identify those kids who were at the greatest risk earlier. And that's what you do when you have these laws. So when the kids that are at the greatest risk for experiencing severe abuse, they're going to be picked up faster and be protected quicker if we have laws. And in fact, looking at data from Sweden over decades, uh, nothing changed in terms of parents going to being punished and going to jail with this law in effect. So it wasn't about making parents criminals now. It was about really just being able to identify and intervene quickly, and it also functions to change the culture. And
It
so,
Yeah.
makes it taboo in essence.
yeah,
Yeah.
But yes, I heard that foster care placement actually reduced as well as adolescent drug and alcohol abuse. And
yeah,
I thought, well, I have so many cases where parents are very harsh with their children, but it doesn't fit the strict criteria of abuse. And so they don't have access to any resources. There's no intervention. I mean, I would love to see schools be able to be more involved in intervening with families very early on, even before kindergarten. And so if you see parents doing this, you can intervene and support, not wait until it's completely so far
yeah.
out of control that it's almost hard to
Yeah, and that's
know
and
what
that's
to do.
exactly the feeling of that's the culture of places like Sweden and other places that have really made these changes decades ago, where
Mhm.
it's about coming together as a culture and supporting each other and identifying people earlier who might have problems because that's what you need to do. It's always intervene earlier is the
Yeah.
key. Yeah.
Yeah.
I know that I'll just say personally, when I was a mother years and years ago, and I was a stepmother, and I remember having problems with my son, and I was very young. I was 18. I didn't have a clue what his behaviors even meant. And this was another era, you know. But I had the blessing to be able to bring him to a counselor. And this lovely older man was just so gentle. And he just was very kind to me. He says, well, you know, just don't hit him. And when he's like this, what you can do is give him some space, use your voice differently. Don't be so frightened. It's all right. Like, he helped me feel less afraid. You know, and it's so funny because recently I was looking back in my journals and I was reading this young mother in me who was so excited because I had learned this and I tried this and I did so well and I didn't hit him, and it was all, this transformation was because of a helper.
Yeah.
You know, a helper.
Yeah, and they need to give you tools that fit your situation.
Yes. And your child, right?
Yeah, because there isn't a one size fits all solution, and you're dealing with, you know, you're also dealing with the fit between the parent and the child too. So you know, it's both of those that have to go together, and it's also knowing that by not hitting the kid doesn't mean you do nothing. You know?
Right. Oh no. Right.
That's really what you need to help parents with, is figure out what can work in their situation.
Yeah.
Well, I know we're coming up on the hour. I just wanted to say thank you so much for all the research that you're doing. It's beautiful work. You are really giving back to children and our future, and I just have so much respect and admiration for you, and I really appreciate your time today with us.
Well, thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Thank you. Just want you to know that, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Leland says, thank you so much for the webinar. It'd be interesting to learn about the history of spanking, how it happened, severity. She just says, thank you so much for being here. So just wanted to share that with you. And Erin says, thank you all. So
thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tracie. Thank you, Robbyn. I always love to come together with you on these.
Me too. It's good to have a partner.
It is. And thank you, parents and educators, for being here.
Yes.
Taking an hour out to come and listen is just, it's dedication. Thank you.
Totally is.
Yeah.